Well, Alex, you speak a lot about coolness and about creativity, about death. And we thought today perhaps it'd be fun to kind of just tease into these different topics and perhaps the relationship between them as well. I mean, maybe a place to start, and it's certainly not like a light place to start, but it's a fun one. It's like, why have you been driving so hard on the need to think about death in the spaces and in the work that we do?
Well, this is sort of obvious, I think, and so I don't feel like I'm saying anything special when I say this, but without death, we don't have any reason to elevate something from beautiful to poetry or to cherish any moment, right? Because what death essentially is, sorry, I'm hearing like a, what death is constancy. And I'll explain that in a second. What life is dynamism against the backdrop of constancy. And because these moments only last for a second, suddenly we begin to cherish them, or we have a sense of their context in the gap, in the sort of never-ending asphalt of our backdrop. And that never-ending backdrop lends the weight and the gravity of beauty and poetry to the moment. So I just simply wouldn't be doing art if it wasn't for death. I simply wouldn't think that a woman's face was beautiful enough to write about if it wasn't for death. I wouldn't cherish the moment my daughter first learns to ride a bicycle if it wasn't for death, because all of those moments would be death, because all of those moments would extend infinitely, and I would never miss them. I would never think, oh my God, how sweet that was. I would never have that poetic sensibility because everything would be existing forever. Everything would be death. So it's this sort of differentiation, this relief from the constancy of the backdrop, and then these momentary blips that we get to cherish and form these poetic references. And so, yeah, I just wouldn't be doing anything I'm doing if it wasn't for death and that awareness. And I think in some ways, the more heightened our awareness, I used to cry every time the sun set. I was going through a weird phase, obviously, but something about I had to reconcile with like the transitory nature of things. It was that intense to me, and everything was so poetic to me, you know, and I had to confront that. But anyway, yeah, art sort of depends on death. I think consciousness depends on death.
I was thinking about, while you were talking, I was thinking about one of the videos you put out where you actually enact a death scene or of some kind. You were sort of hanging and there was money. I can't remember, in some theatrical space. So there's death, which we all experience. And then there's the intentional act of dramatizing your own death. And so can you speak to that a little bit?
You know, I think that well, I'll just say modern culture, I think that our death initiations have evaporated, right? I had no conversation with my dad about death. I remember walking up to his chair. He was a therapist of all things too. No conversation about death. I walked up to the back of his chair. I was like, hey Dad, is it true I'm gonna die? And I remember him turning around, he was doing his taxes and he looked at me over his glasses and goes, yeah. And that was it. And then I walked back to the couch and like kept drawing, but like from my mind, I was melted, right? But I was left alone to deal with it on my own. And so I think that in the absence of death initiations and whatnot, I felt compelled to sort of invent my own. So that video you saw was an unconscious attempt at a death initiation. My heroin addiction was an unconscious attempt at a death initiation. These if it, anyway, yeah, that's the answer.
Is that still as powerful for you right now as it was, when you were at that age where all the rock stars commit suicide, that age of really, that powerful
No,
age where people seem to really need to confront death in some way?
no, it wasn't. I think I had to go through those initiations, and then I went through them.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially the heroin addiction. It's not like I'm promoting that, like, and suggesting that. Although, like, gurus have, right? It's like a way to expedite your spiritual growth, i.e., your confrontation with death. But the only way I was able to stay sober is when I was like really confronted death. And all of those things you saw were after I got sober. I wasn't on drugs for any of those things. When I'm hanging myself by the noose, when I'm lying in puke for 5 hours, when doing all of these sort of like performances, these initiations, I'm stone cold sober. There were these confrontations with at that point I had brought death out of my sort of neurotic death drive and in unconscious and into my conscious. And so all of those, every time I was doing those performances, they were very conscious death initiations.
There's something that I've kind of noticed in myself, actually, since the whole thing popped off in Ukraine. Like, I had a very vivid dream a couple of nights after it started that I was in a dodgy drug deal and I got shot dead. And I woke up, and then it kind of kept playing out over and over and over in my mind. And then I kind of had a few weeks of a really kind of morbid kind of death. I was just, oh my God, I'm going to die. And it's possible that we're going to end up in this horrible war and everything is going to kind of go to, well, my entire life is going to be torn apart. And then that's still there. But then it was this kind of like lightness has crept into me, I've noticed, in the last couple of months as well. And maybe there's, I also kind of put out my first album, which was fun. And maybe that was some kind of like relief. But there's this kind of thing of really, I think the war has made me think, shit, I have no idea how long I'm going to be here. If it's another 5 minutes or another 5 months or another 5 years or another 50 years. And I guess all I'm trying to say here is it's almost like it's helped me. I know you talk about status anxiety as well, right, Alex? I noticed my own kind of status anxiety is kind of declining. I give less of a shit now I'm confronting the fact that I might actually die.
Yeah, and also I would say that the album probably has contributed to your, like, to a diminishment of the sort of death anxiety. I mean, sounds like they happen to line up, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. The more we confront these things, but it's sort of the way when we confront them consciously, the neuroses driving our death drive, so our drive away from death, our unconscious drive to avoid death, which is like essentially all the projects of humanity are like these unconscious death drives. As soon as we bring that into the consciousness, they transform from neurotic into conscious. And then now we're consciously approaching death, and it looks the same. It's like, okay, you had that dream, and someone else is playing a fucking first-person shooter game and confronting mortality all day long, right? They're just killing people, being killed, being born again. You'd think that had this sort of transcendent sort of confrontational effect on them, but it doesn't, because it's still in the unconscious of the neurotic. They haven't brought it forward. So it's still just a death drive that's like over-determining their own lives, as opposed to something that we take into the control of ourselves and start utilizing. But I will say that something about success, like every time I put out an album, every time you complete anything, that is a kind of, well, every completion is a death, right? Every success, and we can unpack this too, but this is, I think, an important aspect of creativity to understand, is that every time you succeed at something, you may be celebrating, etc., but like, that's a plateau of sorts. It's sort of like, well, it's like a new stage. So you think of it as a new floor, but those floors are flat. They just keep going. If if we don't become dissatisfied with that completion, we have no reason to ascend to the next floor. There's no we're just at this death state. And that can happen. And that's probably in part what I'm going through with Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros. Part of the reason we're not performing is because we died because we got successful. So the hunger literally can evaporate once you're full. And that's why I leave that and I look for the new thing. You know what I mean? Because creativity lives in the gaps. Creativity just is the invitation into the gaps. It's and the bigger the gap, the more creativity required.
Do you have anxiety about completing a work of art? I was listening to Rick Rubin talk, and somebody was talking to him, and they asked him, "Do you ever feel like you look back at your work and you're like, I could have done that better?" And he said, "Never, because each time I do something, it's done." So I thought that was a good definition of mastery, in the sense that this person could finish each project, even if it wasn't perfect, because nothing is perfect, but that he could die to each project, in a sense. So that seems to me. Do you relate to that in your artistic process, or do you have anxiety and regret and wish you did things differently? Or is the process of sort of confronting your own death allow you to move on to the next creative project?
I'm never satisfied with what I put out. And I would say that the reason Rick Rubin is satisfied with what he's put out is because he's not the artist on any of his shit.
That's true.
When I produce stuff for other people, it's very easy for me to be like, it's done. Don't worry about it. That take was great. And they're like, nah, it's not good enough. And that's because their sense of their being is in that. And for me, it's just that's not me. And when we have a more existential weight associated with the art we're making, it becomes a much different ballgame, you know?
But you must have these moments, right, where the heaven and earth kind of opens up.
Of course.
And that's really the moment of sort of death and pure life at the same time, right?
Yeah, those when things open up, those are like discovery moments, right? It's like, and you've sort of reconnected, or they're religious moments. They're ritualistic. They're non-traditional.
Yeah.
So they're an aha. They're a sense of newness. They're a sense of like, this has never happened before. And again, that's the gaps, right? It's like you gambled your identity, you gambled your constancy, your redundancy, everything that makes you gambled and entered the void, and you came up with something. And those moments are the best fucking moments possible, because as opposed to looking for an established other that you're trying to unify with and in this sort of position of disempowerment, or as opposed to trying to sort of maintain the brand of self, which looks like creativity, but isn't, in my opinion.
That's so interesting. The other thing I liked that Rick Rubin said, though, is he was recording a band, and they had this moment, like they created the perfect sort of, and then he just said, go on to the next thing. So I think maybe that we become attached to the glory, right? And forget about the death, or we forget about that we have to leave something behind and move on to the next.
Yeah, I would say that his attitude is the ideal attitude, but he gets to arrive at it easier and without much static because he's not the artist.
Sure.
But yeah, that's sort of like, oh, it's done. I did that. And I do think that's it's a healthy attitude to anything, right?
Indeed, yeah. But I thought that like the artists were shocked by that because they wanted to revel, in that glory, and so I know there is that seduction of perfection in a way.
Yeah, there's a seduction of perfection, which is, again, I think, unconscious death drive at work. It's like the desire to be complete, the desire to unify, the desire to have this perfect thing, which is becomes this sort of constant asphalt. And I think that, I don't know. For instance, I don't know if you guys relate to this, but when I make a song, I make a ton of demo. They go through innumerable iterations of demodom before I'm like, okay, that's the final version. And if I send any of those incomplete demos out to any friends or to my manager before it's complete, my desire to complete the song precipitously drops. In fact, I'm very likely to never finish it.
Yeah, wow.
Because the sense of sharing plays the part of a completion, and then it dies. And you no longer sort of, the drive to complete it diminishes. Doesn't evaporate, but it diminishes. You know when it can increase? If he says, oh, this is amazing, oh boy, song's dead.
Yeah, right.
He says, then suddenly I'm like, fuck you. And I go back and I make it, I start working on it more or whatever. I'm like, oh, I guess it's not done, which is part of why argumentation, IDW or something like that is generative for me.
But there is a sense that in the internet world that we can be kind of prostitutes or whore ourselves in some kind of way by just giving birth to something before it's ready, or midwifing something that needs the time and gestation and solitude and turmoil of that creative act.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the biggest balance that I struggle with is there's that initial inspiration, right? Because we could talk like, how do you get creative and how do you and how do you get create the mode for creativity? And you have that, you find a gap, you gamble your identity, you enter into it, you come up with an idea, it's phenomenal, and then what? It's just a raw idea. Now you're going to spend the next 9 months formatting it into a book. None of that's going to have that feeling to it, right? Now, why are you formatting it into a book? We have to mention capitalism, right? We have to mention product. We have to mention all of these aspects of the format and there may be other aspects. Maybe there's something really beautiful and religious about formatting it, but you are in the end making a product you're trying to sell. And so we have to bring that into the calculus. So, I struggle with that a lot in terms of creativity. Why can't I I've built a website, for instance, called Demo Baby, where we're going to release soon. Which is you put up your demos unfinished and that's it. You never finish them. The site is for really shitty SoundCloud songs. That's the site that I want. I want songs that sound completely underproduced. As soon as you feel like it's ready or you get excited about it, share it. And then it's done. Forget it. And maybe what we can do is attune and acculturate people to the sound of unfinished work such that becomes the product. Because I think this whole polishing a turd thing has gotten out of control. So anyway, there's two sides of that, right? You have the initial inspiration and why not share it? Or the initial inspiration and now I have to make it look like everything else so that it can partake in the market, Anyway.
What was it you said something a moment ago that I thought was interesting to kind of zoom in a bit more? Brand of self.
Oh, yeah.
As opposed to, say, being in the
state
of seeing the gap and going into the kind of sacrificing your identity or whatever it was you felt. Because I think it's one of the, I don't even want to kind of to moralize it, but I think it's one of the the attractors of the internet is to create a brand of self.
Yeah.
It's kind of everywhere because now you can make a career out of being an influencer, out of being a kind of cardboard cutout personality.
Well, look, man, again, it comes back to death because repetition over time, redundancy over time, across infinity is immortal, is the immortal realm, right? That's how we immortalize ourselves. Media itself, creating drawing a picture of a fucking cow on the wall. The reason you draw it on the wall instead of just telling someone about it so that it'll stay there. And then from this moment to that moment and then the next day and the next lifetime, a billion years later, that thing is still there. You've immortalized that thing in this moment and extended it to all the other moments. That's the first media. That's the reason for media. It's an immortalizing machine. And so what we're encouraged to do as artists, especially, and I've gotten in trouble for switching my brand, what we're encouraged to do, because we're on the immortalizing machine, is to come up with our image and then repeat it every day. because the more that happens and disseminates, the more famous you are. And the more famous you are, the more immortal you are. And that's the whole fucking allure of this sort of redundancy of identity. You know, it's not simply that like, oh, I want to be famous. It's like, oh, I want to be immortal. I want to be sort of ubiquitous. The problem is that, you know, I wrote down here because I'm like the essay I'm writing. If there's one thing I love about the ascendance of they, them pronouns, it's that a single person can now be so easily confused for the plural form. It reminds me of the Walt Whitman, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes.
Multitudes, yeah.
That is the real state of creativity. That's the real state of being.
Mm-hmm.
Is like this sort of natural oscillation between selves, not self. And anyway, and that's the other reason I had to like stop Edward Sharpe for a time, is because when we get into that, you know, we're told to find yourself. Well, obviously we've lost ourselves, apparently. So now we're like finding ourselves. But once you find that self, you better not leave it, right? Once you find your you better keep doing that. Never leave yourself after you've found yourself. And that becomes your brand. And if you leave it, and here's where trust comes in and societal sort of construction comes in. Trust is based on redundancy. If I trust you, that means that I trust you to be the same you are now as you will be tomorrow. It's this sense of redundancy across time, again. And if you're going to change suddenly and embrace your multitude, suddenly I lose trust in you, right? Now you're a fraud, or I make some denigrating remark about you. But we're very much encouraged, just the very nature of our beings is to be brands. And as artists, to be brands. And if you switch that up, you find yourself here and then you find yourself over here, you get lambasted. But it's the only path to maintaining access to creativity. You have to be able to burn your identity. Because if that's what happens, you have to be able to say, I'm going to enter this gap and I don't know what's going to happen when I come out. I'm not going to try and self-preserve my identity through this gap. Otherwise, I won't be able to come up with anything because I will have brought my thing. I need to empty to receive, you know, that whole thing. So anyway, yeah.
So you mentioned the they pronoun. You mentioned, you know, so we're a men's group here, which is kind of unusual. And so what I'm curious about is I noticed that the artists that I love the most have a very ability to, you know, be a very androgynous and do exactly what you're talking about, switch roles, sexual roles or personas, or, you know, Dylan and Bowie and Tom Waits and all those kind of people. And they're always seem to be sort of unfashionable in the moment. And one of the things I liked that you said was like, when you became famous, you were trying to be sincere, which is sort of a paradox, right? Because everything that was coming out at that moment was very fake. And so, okay, here's the moment to be sincere, right? So it's always being kind of off in some kind of a way.
Yeah. Being earnest was the most punk rock thing I could have done in 2000.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And now
That's
it's
beautiful. I love it.
It's the lamest thing you can do. So it's like, you know, it became too popular too quickly, and yeah.
So what do you think about this business of masculinity and femininity and separating and combining the two? And do you feel like a masculine man, or do you feel like because I feel like artists really have a strong ability to be both, to be feminine and masculine, you know, simultaneously. And really embody the feminine. Do you think about that, or?
Yeah, I think that I like being like a dude. Like I like being a dude sometimes. Like most of the time, probably. Like that's what's most fun to me. You know, because I like being a tough guy. I like boxing. I like being a tough guy. You know what I mean? And that's like the most fun sort of armature for that sort of character. But yeah, absolutely. Like, first of all, I was, you know, like when I was, I don't know, 19 to 27, I was dressing mostly in women's clothes. You know, I just, to me, like when I hear, like, don't get me wrong, I think men's groups are really important, and I've been a part of a couple. But they're important for reasons that are non-fundamental. That's my opinion.
What does that mean?
They're important for superstructural reasons, not base structural reasons. They're not important because of a base code or a base language that is fundamentally different and partitioned into feminine and masculine. Mm-hmm. It's important because of a superstructural refraction where the base language comes in and refracts through these superstructural cultures and religions and edicts and ways of behavior and, redundancies, habits, culture, that then sort of frustrate the base code such that like the only safe places, oh, hey, Chicha, the only safe places are amongst this group or that group. And it's not just men and women, right? It's like, I feel more at home amongst these kinds of people. And, it's like a club within club, and it's just sort of a nesting doll, nested hierarchies of safety. But I think men is one of them because of this refracting. Yeah.
When you say it's like superstructure, is that a way of kind of saying it's necessary because of cultural reasons rather than because of some inherent biological difference? Like, because for example, where I kind of see the necessity or the value of men's groups arising from is kind of how the difference in how libido and the sexual body impacts the psyche of men and women differently.
Yes, it does. And it does. So I think that the way to parse this for me is like language and biology. If we just like take those two for just a moment and separate them and say that our reality is built on our use of symbology. And I'll just say language as the umbrella. So don't think of language just as words, but just language as the whole thing of communication, the whole thing of translation, what we see, how we interpret, all of that. And then you have biology. It's not that biology isn't fundamental, but that the way we understand biology is through language. So when I say base, like that, you could almost think of like what I'm saying as masculine, feminine does not necessarily, that masculine, feminine exists in superposition, in multipolarity, simultaneously, very similar to a charm mason or a Schrodinger's cat, existing in a quantum superposition of male-female. You can think of that sort of as subphysics or to our physics. And so when I say base code language, I mean that everything that we're seeing is sort of superstructural. So I have a tendency to think spiritually. So when I say it's not fundamental, I mean spiritually fundamental at this sort of sub-physics level of like base code, pre-linguistic language, sort of just like the hum of everything. Because again, the hum of everything is my fundamental when it comes to creativity. So that's what I dive into. So when I get creative, I'm not getting creative as a man. That would fuck up everything. I have to dive into the void in which male, female, all of it is existing simultaneously. It's just a base code of drone. I have to empty myself of those preconditions. So in that sense, and then of course, when I come up, I'm a man, and then the lyrics and the language and the way I move and all these things express themselves as a guy with a dick,
So the base is kind of like the original Adam is androgynous or something. The base is this kind of union of all things, right? And that's where you want to take off your male identity or your female identity and dive into. You called it a drone or a hum or it seems like that is. Yeah, I think it seems like that's what we do in meditation, or that's what we do in religious ritual, or is it we kind of cast off our identities? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's
and then it re-arises another identity, or as a little bit different than what we were before we went into that place.
Yeah, I think that's the only way to really change, is to let go of everything. It wouldn't make sense to me to let go of all that I know about myself, except for the fact that I'm a man. I'm just going to get into a state where I'm letting go of everything to enter the void. And then when I come back out, I'm a man, and everything that I learned refracts through that. But I have an awareness that the fundamental impulse that came through me was neither here nor there, or rather more appropriately was both, was everything, not both, but just all of it, because that is the state of, well, the zero, the totality. The only nothings, the only voids are totalities. That's why they're so rich. That's why when we dive into nothing, we come up with so much, because they contain everything. That's the only way they can express themselves as nothing.
So art is a religious activity. Sorry, go ahead, Owen.
Well, I was just thinking, I like that this idea of diving into the hum as perhaps being an explanation for why artists so often manifest a kind of androgyny, even while, say, perhaps being mostly identified with a particular body. There is a kind of openness to both, or whatever, how many poles that exist. And I kind of think also the idea of having a muse, at least often the kind of ancient male artists would talk about kind of being inspired by this female goddess who would kind of whisper to you, but then often is kind of herself speaking through the work. I'm thinking as well, even I just started reading, what's the book? Madame Bovary by Flaubert. My French is terrible, right?
Flaubert, yeah.
Yeah, but he kind of says, people were saying, who is the character of Madame Bovary based off? And he says, she's me.
Mm-hmm.
There's something of this feminine spirit speaking through a masculine artist there. And this isn't always the case, but I'm kind of interested in that.
Yeah.
That dance.
One of my favorite, when I write songs for other people, or I pretend to, or whatever, it's the most fun shit to write is from a woman's point of view. Because those are those are the pop songs that actually allow themselves to really express themselves the way they feel. Because men don't typically in pop songs really express weakness. I mean, they do, but I hate those. I just think those songs, I don't know. I prefer when a woman is expressing the weakness. I very often don't believe it. And usually in the men's song, there's a quip about whatever, or the women are the only ones, for instance, in pop songs right now, who can express pure rage at their partner. I'm gonna you're gonna get paid back, motherfucker. Oh, you put me down now, but just watch. All of that, that's also, more allowance, more permissiveness there. And so, yeah, I allow myself to write from that point of view all the time, because sometimes that's just the shit. Sometimes the lyric
is that sorry to interrupt. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just saying, sometimes the lyric that comes out, because I'm doing gibberish onto the microphone, I don't know what I'm going to say, comes out and it's oh, I love you, man. But it's not a bro. I'm oh shit, this is a woman's song. But I didn't know. It just came out.
Yeah. Because maybe the essence of masculinity, the inner essence of masculinity is femininity, and vice versa. You're kind of arguing that there's no essence, and I'm wondering about that, because I feel that I feel that there is an essence, in the sense that that as you say, emotionality is total full on femininity, and women can do that to the hilt, and men it's almost detachment, and it's maybe what you would call the cool versus the sulfuric, in alchemical terms.
Yeah, I agree that that's the way that all of that presents itself, and that there may be something relatively fundamental. But all I'm saying is that when I say essential, I wanted to refer us just to language, to base code, to our sense of how we view the world at the fundamental hum level. When I go into that, I just don't feel that. That's all. But I feel it as soon as I come out. So yeah, it's there. I would say there's an essence, and it's maybe just the paradigm we live in. And I'm not one of those people who's like, the base hum is this way, so everything else is a fallacy. It's all, this is this phenomenology of the fucking world. It is what it is. We live in our subjectivities and we experience what we experience, and to write it all off as propaganda would be ridiculous. So there's reason to take it all seriously. But I think that for me, when we reify the things that we experience in the super sort of official or in the superstructural realm, and we reify those as necessarily being essential because otherwise they could not manifest, what we're doing is cordoning off our ability to learn any more about what is happening. So if I say, well, the way you're acting is the way you're acting because that's all the way down to base reality, you, there's nothing else to be learned in that chain of you. There's no reason why you're acting the way you're acting. You are acting the way you're acting because that is fundamentally you at the root. Then there's nothing to know about you except what I see in front of me. And I just don't experience that as my experience of getting to know people.
How I would put that is that the masculinity is completely mysterious, and so is femininity. But I wouldn't discount the character. I wouldn't discount the categories. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
I like what we reached in a conversation we were having last week, because one of the things where we're at with this group at the moment is we're kind of working out what we're doing going forward. So we're kind of in this limbo state of throwing ourselves into the unknown and trying to kind of work out what is it. We all get a strong sense that doing this masculine group talking about philosophy and art is valuable, but it's kind of tricky to know why. One of the words that came up was uncovering, as opposed to like there's some groups that want to talk about restoring or renewing or rebuilding masculinity, but there's something about uncovering it that I find very interesting. It's like kind of going on a search underneath the hood of a signifier without really knowing what's going to be found there.
Yeah,
exactly. And even that journey itself has to be done ignorantly. Otherwise, it's not being done honestly, right? Because if we go in, or you go in to these sort of like subterranean explorations, thinking you'll know exactly what you're going to find, that of course is going to color the excavation. And again, so then that means that discovering what masculinity is about is again a creative process, ideally, where again you let go and you say, I don't know, and you go into a void and you leave the identity and you say, I have this one question to the oracle of nothing, and I'm going to abandon myself to it and see what comes up, and so this whole thing can be a creative process in that sense. Yeah.
And that seems to me, I don't want to be insisting on this point, but it seems the masculine is about the formless to a certain extent, and the femininity is about accumulating forms or making things concrete or giving things an identity or giving things a like the masculine on its own is just kind of like nothing, right? But it becomes something through the birth canal or through touching the feminine, through being killed by the feminine and reborn again, and all those things that we experience as a younger person. Does that make sense to you?
I'm trying to I'm trying to see that as something like grounded in me. I think I would just have to say I don't know. Okay. I don't know, because that implies almost cosmological that has like cosmological implications, and
yeah, and religious ones too. And that's the other kind of place I want to go with you a little bit, if you don't mind, is
sure.
because we've kind of talked about that a little bit, and so I'm interested in you're very interested in ritual, and you're very interested in philosophy, and you're very interested in science, and you have this amazing intricate mind, but also this incredible feeling texture and how you express yourself in your art. How do you feel about, like, where do you situate yourself in terms of spirituality and religion, if that's not a, let's say, a too personal question? Or
I'm very torn.
Torn.
Yeah, I'm very torn in several directions. There's something that bothers me about the lack of creativity in that we all seem to be like have the capacity for.
You mean
like,
in the formalism of religion, or
in the abstracted formalism of religion, and it seems to exist in our minds, independent of whether or not we call ourselves religious. That there is a very narrow rubric through which we are able to access the language of spirituality. We get creative with, I call it source, or I call it, it's like, yeah, but it's all the same. Everything in spirituality is like very much codified. You can swap out a few names here and there, and it means you're part of this religion or that. But the scope, the fundamental scope of the operations and relationship that we have to spirituality is incredibly narrow and self-similar. And because of that, I think I have a war within myself, because there's something about that I just described that validates God, that validates the concept of source or energetic fucking universal whatever, like, or consciousness or whatever it is, that it's so ubiquitous, and that the scope of our language around the concept is so narrow that nobody can ever seem to come up with anything else. Because even if you distill like, I think everything is energy, it's all the same. It's like the Jesus story over and over again in different contexts and settings. And there's something that's like, okay, there's something here. There's something to this. And then the other part of me is like looking for the gaps. It's like, no, there's something else. There's something else to be discovered. And that's the stuff that I'm most interested in. And that's what really drives most of my metaphysical writing and work and thinking. And so that's where I'm at right now. And to somewhat of the detriment of my own spiritual practices. So my meditations and whatnot are sort of like, I'm trying to keep them going a little bit while I figure out what's really happening over here, so that eventually I can inform my spiritual practices of this thing. And they're starting to become the same thing, like when I'll find myself writing about these things and getting that same spiritual sort of like, kick. And it's a creative kick again, and creativity is again spirituality, because you like real creativity, where you go into the void, into the nothing that is everything. That's the meditation. That's the real meditation. So it's all sort of coming together for me, where I'm investigating spirituality and metaphysics as my creative mode. So it's all sort of become the same thing now.
Yeah, I was thinking about how, people say God who's up here, he's high, right? And then there's the ground of being, which is the other way you often describe, that. And I have more affinity for that than I do for calling it God. Perhaps that's my bias because of the tradition I'm practicing in, but the ground of being is seems to be the place where that hum that you're talking about is located. Mm.
Yeah, I like the as below, so above model, the inversion of the ground. And yeah, I think about that a bit, yeah. Especially when you think of mycelia, like how their synaptical structures mimic, like are very, very, very closely similar to the human brain. And you end up with this sort of like, as below, so above, and then we create the internet to replicate the God ground of mycelia with another sort of mycelial structure. Yeah, I like the whole. There's a fun sort of like.
I don't know what that is. I'm sorry. Can you explain what it is? Mycelium structure?
Oh, just fucking mushrooms.
Mushrooms. Ah, yeah, right. Okay, gotcha.
But they're all over the planet, and yeah, and they communicate with each other. And there's their tentacle sort of structure, their mycelia root like network is very similar to the way the brain communicates, just a lot slower. And the whole Jesus thing of the stone date theory and whatnot. So the whole, you can create a fun sort of mythology around as below, so above.
Yeah.
Enjoy does something that I kind of think about quite a lot, and I've probably said it here before. Cadell told me it's like one of Hegel's great tweets that the three paths to the absolute are religion, art, and philosophy.
His great tweets?
Yeah. One of his. No, I've not actually found the passage where he says that, if he does say that explicitly. But it kind of, I think about it a lot. It seems like a really good like Zen koan, that there are these three paths: religion, art, and philosophy. And they're somehow all kind of going towards the same thing, but they're also different. And so like when I hear you saying, Alex, that you kind of got your meditation thing and then you're kind of cheating on it to go and do the philosophy and kind of hoping that it's going to kind of come back sometime. That's what made me think of that. And I've kind of noticed that I had a phase a few years ago when I was really, really heavy into yoga and meditation. And it was great, but I wasn't writing anything, wasn't really playing any music. It was like all of my creative libido was going into that. And then more recently, I've kind of just let all of the practices go and just really kind of focusing on art. And that is, I actually feel better. So I don't know what the fuck's quite going on there.
Yeah. Well, it's weird to stay, it's difficult and strange to be dead all the time. And that's what doing yoga all the time is. And I don't mean dead like in a pejorative sense. I just mean it in an operational sense. If you're constantly in the nothingness of everything, which again is that sort of like endless asphalt, it's a floor, it's a flatness. There's no distinct dynamics within it. Then you're effectively like, you're dead. You're the walking dead. And that's cool. It's super peaceful and very generative and cool. But and at the same time, I think it's, as I mentioned, like being in a neurotic state where you're so afraid of that state that you're creating all of these sort of like dynamics just to stay away from that flat line. That's also not desirable. But rather being in a state where you submerge, you come out, and then you paint and you play and you have creativity, and then that creativity has a success, it dies, and then you look for the next thing, if there is a next thing,
There's this formula in the Hindu tradition of sattva, rajas, and tamas, which is like inertia, harmony, and fiery energy. And like, you could classify people who are into the karma yoga, who are very, very, they have to do work all the time. They have to do high powered energetic activities. And the people who are sort of sattvic are not really, they're sort of otherworldly. They need to go into emptiness a lot. And then, I guess there's the philosopher types as well. And so yeah, I think what Owen is speaking to is this kind of, we are this sort of, we have these different centers of our being, which are connected, and we have to, there's moments to go into one area of high energy, high power, exploration, and then there's moments to go into emptiness, a lot of emptiness, at least that's what I find.
I think so. I think so too. And I think also one thing I wanted to, one thing I ask myself all the time is why am I doing something? And I think that a lot of us are like, I gotta be creative. Like, I'm not working enough, or I just wasn't making stuff. Sometimes there's just not like, we think we have to make things because we grow up in the base structural capitalism that we grow up in. And we want to survive, and we need enough money. So there's a reason. But once you have that, if you have that on some steady level, like I have a very strange predicament, because I make enough money from previous songs that I literally don't have to work to live. So why do anything? I no longer have that motivation. So I ask myself this all the time. It's like, I need to find a gap. I can only get excited about gaps, and they have to be big gaps. Small gaps are cool, but like they're not going to take up much of my time. I need something like, what is death? I need like the gap. Because otherwise I just fucking don't have a reason to do anything. When I'll just give this example, because this whole thing is about creativity. When my biggest song, Home, which, like, if you've been to a wedding in the last 10 years, you probably heard. When I wrote that song, like when we recorded the demo and I like listened to it, or while we were recording it, actually, I remember being like, I know this song is going to be popular because it fills this hole. I could see the hole, the hole in fabric in society that was empty, that this song would fill. Same with the band. I was like, okay, like I said, everyone is being ironic and sardonic, and I was being that way, and I fucking am over it. I'm going to do the most dangerous thing I can do, which is fill this hole over here, which is be earnest. Because at the time, like, Obama Hope hadn't started. That whole like, no one was selling Hondas with fucking acoustic guitars yet. And so there was a hole that I felt like was necessary. Okay, this is going to be helpful. This is a worthy hole to fill. And I guess that's very phallic and whatever, we could get into that, but I'm just not as interested in that. It's just a hole in society that I wanted to fill, right? And I'm waiting for that next hole now. That's what I'm doing. So I'm just not that motivated. My manager, I just got off the phone with him earlier. He's like, let's do this and that. I was like, why? Why? To make who cares? NFT, it's like NFT shit, of course, he wants to do. It's like, we're going to do these serialized NFTs of your songs. It's like, what's that going to, like, what's the, why? And I think
sounds like there's always something bigger that needs to,
Yeah, but it doesn't need, but why? Like, yeah. I think the thing is, not everyone should create shit. Like, we shouldn't have 80,000 iterations of the Beatles.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
The only reason we have that is for products and sort of like, I think there's an opportunity here for us to chill out and be creative when there are gaps. Now, the important thing is to constantly like look for gaps, to be uncomfortable enough that like you're like considering things and analyzing things. Is this thing? What problem can I solve? And I think that if there's one thing Silicon Valley probably has taught us, is like all about problem solving. Like a pitch is like, here's the problem, here's the solution. That's every pitch, right? And most of the problems are bullshit. But like, if you can find a problem that
You need a
want to
big
solve,
problem, right?
a big problem,
A big problem, a big gap.
enjoy yourself. Otherwise, because it's, I don't know.
Maybe I could ask you one more question, Alex, and then we can move on to Q&A. Is that all right, Owen? Or do you have another question
make it a quick
as well?
one, and then let's go to Q&A.
I just want to know, because you talked about coolness. Where does coolness fit into this? Because you did this talk on the Stoa, which was very interesting about the cool and what is cool, and what is, what do you where are you at in terms of that? Like, why is it, what is cool anyway? And why are people considered cool and not cool? And what is this game of cool?
Okay. I'm going to do this little joke I may have done for you before, but how many hipsters does it take to screw in a light bulb? What, you don't know? That's a joke, right?
Yeah.
That's cool. Cool is about belonging to the most exclusive nested hierarchy, that club within a club within a club. Not just get into the club, certainly not be shivering outside in front of the doorman, and not just get into the club, but then get into the VIP section. And then if you know the owner, and you get into the back room, into the office. And the thing is that each one of those clubs removes you further and further from the outside. You're several operations now removed from being kicked out. So this again relates to death, the tundra, right? Outside is death. You be ostracized, excommunicated. The cooler you are, the more sort of safe you are within like a cloistered cell. But that's just one aspect of cool. There's the great irony of cool is that it inverted the entry fee to get up into the VIP section. So instead of needing money, what you needed to display was that you didn't need anyone there, and that you could be out in the tundra if you wanted to, that throwing you out of the club would mean nothing to you. That, because this is why the loner is the epitome of sort of archetype of cool, right? Because the loner can survive beyond.
Doesn't give a fuck.
He doesn't give a fuck. And so suddenly he has more power than everyone who paid money to get up into away from the tundra. Because this guy doesn't give a shit about the tundra. So he could be gone, he could be here. And that's sort of like this supposed aura of cool, the Marlboro Man and James Dean and all that. And this idea of like, and I think where everything we've talked about comes together for this is that rebellion, going against, there's no better way to display that you could be in the tundra if you wanted to than dissent against the group to which you belong. Mm-hmm. Right? If I told all you guys, fuck you, don't give a shit about your fucking men's group, knowing that I would never get invited again, right? Then I can prove to myself, I don't need anyone, right? I can prove to you guys like whatever. And my power, there's nothing you can do to me now, right? And so I used to do that. That's why like I would wear ironic t-shirts, or like fuck you, you fucking fuck t-shirts are the most popular t-shirt being sold on Frenchman Street in New Orleans right now. People walking around telling everybody they see, fuck you, to preemptively start the cycle of I don't give a shit, right? I'm already on the outside. That's my inside.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's a whole,
is that a flirtation with death as well?
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an erotic obsession with like trying to unconsciously confront, this death thing, cigarettes and the whole thing. Yeah. But cool is also cool. So I don't know. It works on me.